Cowboy was given a Chinese girl as a cruel joke, but her first words made him freeze. They said it like a favor, like the world was doing him some twisted kindness, handing him a scrap of life wrapped in shame. But Jonah Carver knew a curse when he saw one. The girl stood still beneath the edge of his porch, not flinching from the sun, not blinking at the wind. The hem of her dress clung to her ankles, stiff with the salt of long miles and longer silences. Her hands hung at her sides, like they'd forgotten purpose. She wasn't trembling, she was past that. She looked like someone who'd been emptied. Silas grinned as he reined in his horse, the dust still swirling around his boots like heat from the pit. "Thought you could use a warm body," he said, voice slick with false charity. "Keeps the house from echoing so much." He nodded toward the children watching from behind the window. "Ain't right for them to grow up without a woman's hand." Jonah didn't speak. He hadn't said much to anyone in nearly 2 years, not since Sarah's breathing slowed into stillness one winter morning, and the roses by the porch withered without asking. He just looked at the girl. She didn't lift her eyes. Silas shrugged, tossed a carpet bag to the ground like he was unloading tools. "Name don't matter, just the China girl from down Carson way. Belonged to a gambler who ran out of luck. Thought of you when I saw her." He laughed, as if he'd made a clever joke. Jonah didn't laugh. He didn't curse or raise his rifle, though it leaned within reach behind the door. He simply waited. Silas spat in the dirt, gave a mocking tip of his hat, and turned his horse back toward the trail. His boots were barely out of earshot before the wind swallowed the sound, like it wanted no part in what had just happened. Jonah stood on the porch a moment longer, arms folded, shoulders heavy with a silence he no longer knew how to break. The girl remained where she was, eyes lowered, posture neither defiant nor submissive, just hollow. Inside the house, Eli and Miriam watched, 2 small shapes pressed against the glass, waiting for their father to do something they couldn't name. He finally descended the steps, his boots scuffing small puffs of red dirt. When he stopped in front of her, she didn't flinch, didn't speak. Her gaze remained fixed on the boards beneath his feet, as if those splinters were the only true thing left in the world. He didn't offer a welcome. He didn't ask questions. He simply pointed to the small side room built years ago for a ranch hand who drank too much and stayed too little. "There," he said, one word, flat as the plains. She nodded, just once, and picked up the carpet bag. It barely made a sound, like it held nothing of weight but everything of consequence. She disappeared into the room without another look. Jonah turned back toward the door. The screen slammed behind him like a final word. That night, the ranch was as quiet as ever. The floor creaked beneath Jonah's boots, the wind hissed through the cracks in the walls, and the children slept with their hands curled into small fists beneath their chins. But something had changed. There was another breath in the house, another shadow in the hall, and though she made no sound, no demand, and claimed no space that wasn't given, Jonah felt it, the beginning of something. Not forgiveness, not yet, but movement. And somewhere far beyond words, he feared, or maybe hoped, that the joke Silas meant to play might just be the thing that woke him from the grave he'd been living in. She didn't enter the main house that night. Jonah heard the creak of the side door, the soft groan of the cot's old springs, and then nothing. No weeping, no footsteps, only wind brushing through the cracks in the eaves, and the familiar ache of silence pressing against the windows like frost. By morning, she was already awake. He saw her from the corner of his eye as he stepped out to check the livestock. She was seated on the porch's lowest step, hands folded neatly in her lap, as still as carved stone. No breakfast, no fire, no movement, but the slow shift of her eyes toward the gray morning sky. Jonah didn't speak. He wasn't sure if he'd forgotten how, or if it was just that nothing seemed worth saying anymore. He walked past her, boots crunching frost-bitten grass, and she didn't follow with her gaze. Inside the house, Eli and Miriam ate quietly. Their eyes kept darting to the window, not in fear, but in uncertainty. They hadn't asked who she was. Children could smell grief like smoke, and knew not to fan the flames. That day passed without incident, and the next. The girl, Jonah still hadn't asked her name, moved through the edge of their world like fog, present, persistent, but never demanding form. She took to sweeping the porch when no one was looking, scrubbed old stains from the floorboards of the kitchen while Jonah was mending fence posts at the southern border. The children's clothes, which had hung stiff on lines for weeks, began appearing folded, softened, mended with care. She never entered the family space while he was home. Only when she was sure he was gone did she step across the threshold, and always left it as if no one had been there at all. At first, Jonah thought it was unsettling. Then he found it almost reverent. The ranch, once draped in the heavy stillness of morning, began to change. Not in large, sudden ways, but in the kind of details only a man who'd been drowning in sameness would notice. The windows no longer wore the grime of forgotten days. The pantry was organized. A loose board on the stairs no longer creaked. The scent of lye soap began to replace the old musk of time. But most of all, it was the children. Eli, always the cautious one, started spending more time near the porch. He never spoke to her, but he'd linger, pretending to whittle a stick that didn't need shaping. Miriam, younger and more honest, began leaving small things in the garden bed. A pebble she liked, a wildflower from the field. Little offerings, little tests. The girl never rejected them. She simply accepted, the way the earth accepted sunlight. Without thanks, without demand. Jonah watched all of this and said nothing. He didn't know what to do with it. This woman who moved like smoke and treated his grief as if it were a room that could be gently aired out. One evening, he passed her on his way to the barn. She was kneeling in the dirt by the fence, plucking at stubborn weeds near the rose bed Sarah had planted years ago. The sight made him stop. The rose bed had gone untouched since Sarah died. The thorns had taken over, the petals long blown away. And still, he'd never let anyone go near it. But the girl, she wasn't pulling it up like a thing to be erased. She was cleaning around it, tending it like something sacred. He almost called out, almost told her to leave it, but the words died on his tongue. Instead, he stood there, watching her hands in the dirt, bare, slow, purposeful. She didn't look up. He walked away. That night, he couldn't sleep, because for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't sure if the silence in the house was mourning anymore, or if it was waiting. Can you guess what's about to happen? Leave your prediction in the comments. Like the video to motivate me to make the next videos. Jonah didn't see her at first. He'd ridden out early, chasing fence posts and silence across the South Ridge, trying to forget the weight of a name he hadn't asked for. By the time he returned, sweat stiff and dust heavy, the sun was dragging long shadows over the porch, and something felt off, not wrong, just unfamiliar. The floor inside no longer whispered with grime under his boots. The dishes, he hadn't touched them in days, were clean, stacked in quiet precision. The stale scent of morning and closed windows had been replaced with a faint trace of lye and lavender. It was like someone had opened the house and let the air in for the first time since Sarah died. He paused at the kitchen doorway, brow furrowed. A dish rag hung to dry by the window. A pile of folded laundry sat on the bench, Eli's shirts, Miriam's dresses. His fingers hovered over one hem. The stitching was tight, tidy, practiced. Not a girl's work, a woman's. He said nothing. Out back, he found Miriam kneeling near the edge of the barn, her face smeared with dust and a smudge of jelly. "Who gave you that?" he asked quietly, pointing at the half-eaten biscuit in her hand. She shrugged, eyes flicking toward the shed. "It was on the porch." Later that evening, as the sky bruised into deep orange, he passed by the side room where she slept. The door was ajar. He caught a glimpse. A crate-turned table, the carpet-bag neatly tucked, her slippers placed side by side. No clutter, no chaos, just careful order, like everything she touched. She wasn't inside. He found her on the church steps. The old wooden chapel at the edge of the property had stood vacant for years. Dust coated its pews, the altar warped from rain seeping through the roof. No one had set foot there since the winter Sarah passed. But Lynn sat on the steps, her back to the door, hands folded in her lap. She didn't look at him. She just stared ahead, at nothing, at everything. Not in prayer, not in defiance, just being. He didn't disturb her. The next morning, the windows in the front room were washed, even the corners, the ones no one ever bothered with. Jonah sat in his chair that evening, staring at the clear glass that now framed the sunset like a picture. He didn't know what unsettled him more, the clarity, or the fact that it hadn't been his doing. That night, he opened Sarah's old Bible, not to read, just to feel its weight again. Pressed between the pages, he found a dried rose, brittle, colorless. He didn't remember putting it there. From outside, he heard soft footsteps, a broom sweeping porch dust in slow, deliberate strokes. He didn't move, didn't speak. The ghost had not only swept the dust from his floor, she was beginning to sweep it from his grief. Jonah found her by the roses. It was mid-morning, the kind of quiet day when the prairie seemed to hold its breath. The sky stretched wide and pale, and even the wind had grown still, like it too was watching. Lynn was kneeling at the far edge of the yard, in the plot of land no one dared touch. The rose bed had once been Sarah's pride, a narrow strip by the fence line, half wild, half tended, where color had bloomed even when everything else on the ranch clung to brown and brittle. After the fever took her, Jonah never touched it. The thorns grew long, unruly. The blossoms shriveled and dropped like forgotten prayers. He let them rot. He told himself it was out of reverence, but really it was fear. Fear that touching what she had loved would be like killing her twice. And now Lynn was there, her knees in the dirt, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hands buried deep in the soil. Jonah froze. She hadn't asked, hadn't looked for permission, and something in him flared, sudden and bright, not rage, but a sick kind of grief masquerading as anger. That was Sarah's ground, that was sacred. But Lynn wasn't pulling the roses. She wasn't tearing them up or reshaping the bed. She was careful, painfully so, clearing only the weeds that choked the base of the old stems. Thorns scratched her wrists, but she didn't flinch. She worked slow, patient, like someone tending a grave. Jonah stayed in the shadow of the barn, hands curled into fists. He wanted to call out, to stop her. But he didn't, because deep down he knew this wasn't desecration, this was devotion. She wasn't erasing Sarah, she was honoring her in the only language she had left. A few hours later, after the sun had slipped low and the children had gone inside, Jonah passed by the garden again. He found a small square of fabric lying near the roses. It was hand-stitched, delicate, a single white flower embroidered in the center. He didn't recognize the bloom, but it was placed gently just beside one of the taller rose stalks, as if offering something that couldn't be spoken, a memorial, or maybe a request for peace. Later that night, when Miriam climbed into his lap, something she hadn't done in months, she showed him a pebble, smooth, oval. "I left it by the flowers," she whispered, "for Mama." Jonah felt something twist in his chest. A pain, yes, but not the old kind, not the weight of grief. This was something different, like the first breath after drowning. Outside, in the dim light of the porch lantern, Lynn passed silently by the window with an empty watering can in hand. She didn't glance inside. She didn't need to. She knew he'd seen, and he knew she understood. The shirt had been dead for months. Jonah kept it only out of habit, a once-favorite work shirt with sleeves worn thin and a tear that split from elbow to cuff. It had snagged on barbed wire one afternoon, and he'd meant to toss it ever since. But somehow it stayed. Folded at the bottom of a drawer, ignored but not forgotten. That morning it was waiting on his bed. He paused at the doorway, brow furrowed. The room was as he'd left it, spare, clean, silent, except for the shirt. Folded neatly. But something was different. He picked it up, ran his fingers along the cloth. The tear was gone. Not just sewn shut, mended. The stitching was fine, almost invisible, the kind that required a steady hand and a practiced eye. And in the center of the patch, subtle and precise, was a small embroidered flower. Not a rose, something else, something delicate, a mountain blossom, the kind that grew only in places stubborn enough to survive frost and neglect. He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. For a long time he didn't move. The thread, he realized, was not from his supplies. It was a muted lavender, soft against the denim, not the kind he kept in the kitchen drawer. He recognized the color. Lynn's old shawl, frayed at the ends. She must have unraveled it thread by thread. He didn't know what it meant. Or maybe he did, and it simply scared him. Because this wasn't utility. This wasn't gratitude. This was identity. She was telling him something without speaking. I am not a ghost. I am not a burden. I am not what he called me. She had skill. She had memory. She had will. And she had taken something broken of his, something he had discarded, and made it whole again. He wore the shirt that day, not because he needed it, but because he didn't know how not to. And when he passed Lynn near the stables, he didn't stop walking, didn't speak, but he felt her eyes notice. Just a flicker, a breath. And though she didn't smile, her hands paused in their work, just long enough to let him know she'd seen. That evening, while stacking firewood by the back door, he caught Eli staring at his sleeve. The boy didn't ask, just ran his finger gently along the edge of the stitching and said, "It looks new." Jonah didn't reply, but inside, something long dormant stirred. Not quite comfort, not yet hope, but perhaps respect. For the girl who mended things, without asking, without expecting, just because it was in her to restore what others had thrown away. The day was warm and windless, a rare grace on the prairie. Jonah had gone early to check the north fence, leaving the yard quiet but not still. Lynn was by the garden again, her garden now, though no one had said it aloud. She moved in silence, hands deep in the soil, coaxing breath from a land that had long forgotten how to give. The rosebed beside her bore the first signs of forgiveness. Tiny green shoots curling through dark earth, stubborn and alive. Miriam watched from the steps, feet bare, holding something in her closed fist. Eli stood farther back, half shadowed by the barn, arms crossed like his father's, but eyes uncertain. Then a step, another. Miriam approached, stopping just short of the garden bed. For a moment Lynn didn't look up. The child opened her hand. Inside was a rusted trowel, the wood of its handle cracked with time. It had once belonged to Sarah. Jonah had stored it in the shed after her death, along with every other thing too painful to touch. Miriam didn't speak, just held it out, small and steady. Lynn sat back on her heels. She wiped her hands on her trousers and took the trowel with both hands, gently, reverently. Their fingers brushed, a brief electric moment, the first touch. Eli stepped forward then, slow and stiff, like a soldier crossing enemy lines. He held a cloth pouch tied with frayed twine. Lynn met his eyes, and for a heartbeat, neither moved. Then he set the pouch down beside the trowel and stepped back. She opened it. Dried seeds spilled into her palm, faded, fragile, yet still full of promise. She looked up at him. A nod passed between them, small, wordless, binding. That afternoon, the three of them worked together. Lynn dug small furrows with the trowel, her movements patient. Eli followed, dropping seeds with a care he usually reserved for his sister. Miriam brought water in an old tin cup, dribbling it too fast, but laughing when the mud splashed her toes. It was not a loud kind of joy, not the raucous laughter of children untouched by sorrow, but it was real. From the hill, Jonah saw them. He didn't approach, just leaned against the fence rail, arms crossed, watching as the garden began to shift from labor to communion. They were building something.
Not just a patch of earth, a covenant. That evening at dinner, Jonah noticed Eli's hands were stained with soil. Miriam's knees were scraped and green. He didn't ask, but when he ladled stew into bowls, he placed a fourth on the table. Not outside, not on the porch, at the table. And for the first time, he did not leave it there for her to find. He waited. The fourth bowl sat in silence. Steam curled from it like breath in the fading light, rising between Jonah and the empty chair across the table. Eli and Miriam ate quietly, spoons clinking against tin, casting glances toward the side room. No one said it, but they were waiting. So was Jonah. He wasn't sure why he hadn't called her. He had placed the bowl down, not outside, not on the porch railing, but at the table. He had made room. That was all he could do. The door creaked. She stepped in like a shadow, bare feet, hands folded, eyes lowered. But there was a stillness in her that had shifted, less like fog, more like stone. She stood at the edge of the table, not sitting, not reaching for the bowl, just watching. Jonah's fingers tightened around his spoon. Then she looked at him, really looked, eyes dark, unwavering. He braced himself for a question, or a request, or maybe accusation. But what she said was simple, plain. "My name is Lynn." The words dropped into the silence like a stone in still water, small but echoing. Eli froze mid-bite. Miriam blinked, her spoon halfway to her mouth. Jonah didn't move. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't a question. It was a statement, a reclamation. She wasn't asking to be known. She was telling him she existed, not as an offering, not as a shadow, not as a debt repaid. As a person, with history, with blood, with a name. He looked at her then, really looked. Not the lowered head, not the silence, but the spine that hadn't bowed, even after everything. The eyes that had seen far more than he ever would. The hands that had touched his grief and hadn't flinched. She stepped back quietly, turning toward her room. Not leaving in shame, but with the calm of someone who had finally spoken truth into a space that had long denied it. Jonah said nothing, not then. But the next morning, he passed her by the garden. She was kneeling, sleeves rolled, coaxing sprouts from the earth. He paused, cleared his throat. She didn't look up. "Lynn," he said, just one word. She froze, not in fear, but in recognition. Then she nodded. That was all. But it was enough. From that day, silence between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like language. The fourth chair had always been there, but no one sat in it. Not since Sarah. It was plain pine, hand-carved years ago by Jonah himself. Strong, steady, meant to last. After she died, he couldn't bring himself to move it, couldn't let anyone else touch it. So it stayed, silent and unfilled, like a gravestone no one dared disturb. Until now. Lynn sat down slowly, as if she too knew the weight that lingered in the grain. No one had invited her. No one needed to. She reached for the bowl as Miriam passed her the bread without a word. Eli poured water into her cup, careful not to spill. Jonah said nothing, but he didn't look away. The meal was quiet, not stiff, not broken, just simple. The kind of quiet that didn't press on the ribs like grief, but settled soft across the shoulders like peace. Outside, the garden was growing. Green shoots lined the furrows Lynn and the children had carved with stubborn hope. The rosebed held its shape. New buds peeked along its spine, soft as whispered promises. Jonah passed by the edge of it every evening now. He didn't stop, but he always looked. That week, he left a ball of thread on the edge of Lynn's table. Good quality, the kind she'd never ask for, but would use down to the last inch. He didn't tell her it was for her. She didn't thank him. The thread was gone the next day. Another night, he left a bar of rose soap on the basin beside her room. Then a worn but warm blanket, folded carefully and placed near her cot. Each offering unspoken. Each one answered, not in words, but in the growing comfort between them. Evenings began to change. Lynn didn't disappear after supper. She stayed. Sometimes by the hearth, patching clothes. Sometimes beside the children, watching them draw shapes in the ash with a stick. Sometimes in the doorway, eyes on the moon. One night, Jonah stepped out onto the porch and found a second rocking chair beside his. The children had dragged it there. Lynn had added a cushion. He didn't sit in it, but he didn't move it either. Instead, he sat in his own and looked at the garden, the stars, and the still house behind him. And beside him, Lynn sat too, not close enough to touch, but not distant either. Shared silence. Shared soil. Not lovers, not strangers. Something older, deeper. A family, not yet spoken, but already growing. If this story of kindness and healing touches your heart, don't hesitate to like and share to spread this warm message. We have many more stories waiting for you to discover. The air changed before the sky did. Jonah felt it in his bones first. That stillness, thick and waiting, like the moment between a question and its answer. The wind had died, the horses paced nervously in the corral, and even the birds had gone quiet. It was the kind of silence that didn't soothe, but warned. He stood on the porch, mug in hand, watching the horizon bruise into deepening shades of violet and ash. Rain was coming, a hard one. He could feel it in the pressure behind his temples. But it wasn't just the storm. He saw the rider before he heard him. A black dot against the wavering heat line. Steady, confident, wrong. The mug lowered slowly. His jaw clenched. It was Silas. Jonah didn't move as the man came closer. Not even when the dust of his horse kicked up against the garden Lynn had so patiently coaxed back to life. Silas dismounted with a familiarity that stung. His grin was wider than the last time, greasier, knowing. "Well, well, Providence surely has a sense of irony," he said, eyes sweeping over the clean porch, the rose bushes breathing again, and the woman standing behind Jonah in the doorway. "She cleaned up nice, didn't she? Looks like my investment turned out better than I thought." Jonah didn't answer. He didn't step aside either. Silas continued, voice slick with amusement. "I got a buyer in Carson City. High price for a girl who already knows her place. So I'm here to collect." Behind him, the clouds boiled darker. Lynn stood still behind Jonah, silent, unmoving. But her eyes were no longer afraid. They were waiting.
Not for Jonah to save her, but for Jonah to choose. He felt the weight of it, not just her life, but everything they had built in silence. The bread she'd baked, the shirt she'd mended, the tiny laugh Miriam had let slip just 2 nights ago. This wasn't about sale or trade. This was about dignity, about home. And what kind of man he was going to be, now that someone had finally seen him, clearly enough to believe in him again. Jonah didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't have to.
His presence alone had begun to change. The man who had once drifted like ash through his own life now stood rooted like an old tree, weathered, yes, but unmoving. Silas stepped forward, one hand resting casually on his belt buckle, the other hovering near his revolver. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Carver. She ain't your wife. She ain't even your kind." Jonah's eyes didn't leave him. "She's not for sale." Silas laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that bounced off the porch beams and died quickly. "You think this is a love story, widower? This is a business transaction gone stale. You got feelings. That's your weakness. I got coin on the table." "No." Jonah's voice was low but final. "This is her home." The words cut sharper than a blade. Silas blinked, thrown off not by rage, but by the certainty. There was no tremor in Jonah's tone, no hesitation, just truth, a boundary drawn in the dust. Behind Jonah, Lynn stepped forward. She didn't touch him, didn't hide behind him. She simply stood beside him, close, like a pillar at his right hand. It was a gesture not of fear, but of alignment. Silas sneered. "You lost your woman, Jonah. Don't go painting this foreign ghost into her shadow. This is about ownership, not salvation." A muscle ticked in Jonah's jaw. "You think this land forgives you because it forgets? You think you can ride back in and take what you left like nothing's changed?" Silas's smile faltered. The wind picked up. The trees whispered. Jonah took a step forward. "She's not yours to take. She never was. You thought you were delivering a joke that day, but God sent her here to save this house." That word, God, landed heavier than the threat of a bullet. Silas glanced at the clouds, the weight of something ancient pressing into his shoulders. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was fear, or maybe it was just the realization that for the first time in years, Jonah Carver wasn't broken anymore. He was something worse for a man like Silas. He was whole. The first drop struck the porch like a drumbeat. Then another. Then 100. Within seconds, the sky gave way. Rain poured in sheets, cold, relentless, cleansing. Silas hesitated, squinting against the downpour. He'd come to collect a possession. What he found was a family, drawn together not by blood, but by choice, and something older than both: loyalty. Jonah stepped down from the porch, water soaking through his shirt in seconds. His boots sank into the earth, soft now, alive. The very ground seemed to reject Silas's presence. "You can't stop me," Silas growled over the roar of rain. "You're just one man." Jonah's voice rose, clear and steady. "I'm one man who's done running." Lightning cracked across the sky like judgment. For the first time in years, Jonah's hands didn't shake, not with grief, not with guilt, not even with rage. They were steady, sure. The fight didn't last long. It wasn't elegant, and it wasn't cinematic. It was real. Mud-slicked fists, grunts, 2 men, one clinging to control, the other reclaiming it. Silas landed a punch, but Jonah didn't flinch. He struck back harder. It was 2 years of sorrow, buried fists, and silence finding their voice through muscle and bone. By the time Silas stumbled backward, blood dripping from his lip, the fight was done. Jonah didn't raise his fists again. He didn't need to. Silas looked up at him, soaked and panting, and finally saw him. Not a broken widower.
Not a rancher holding on to ghosts, but a man reborn through fire and grace. "This is her home," Jonah said again, breath ragged, "and you are not welcome here." Silas spat, staggered to his horse, and mounted without another word. No threats, no boasts. The rain washed the blood from his face as he disappeared into the gray, swallowed by a storm not to destroy, but to cleanse. Inside the house, Lynn stood at the window, hand over her heart, eyes shining not with fear, but with something deeper, reverence. Outside, Jonah turned his face to the rain. A verse once whispered in his childhood church rang faintly in his mind, clear now as thunder. "In a surge of anger, I hid my face from you for a moment, but with everlasting kindness I will have compassion on you." Isaiah 54:8. And in that downpour, Jonah Carver, the man who had once buried his soul beside a rose garden, stood alive. The door creaked softly behind him. Jonah stepped inside, the storm at his back, the heat of the hearth a quiet welcome. He was soaked to the bone, mud streaked across his arms, his knuckles raw and bleeding. But he carried no anger, only silence, and something that felt very close to peace. Lynn was waiting, not with questions, not with judgment, but with a basin of warm water and a tin of salve. A single oil lamp cast a golden halo around the kitchen, painting her face in soft light. She had tied her hair back. Her sleeves were rolled. Her hands, the same hands that had turned dead soil into life, now trembled slightly as they reached for his. He sat without a word. She knelt, took his wounded hands in hers, and began to clean them. Slowly, carefully. The rain drummed against the windows like 1,000 whispers. But here, inside, was only breath and touch and the scent of lavender soap. The same one she'd found weeks ago tucked in a forgotten drawer. Jonah flinched as she dabbed at a cut, but didn't pull away. He watched her work, watched the quiet devotion in each movement. There was no fear in her gaze, only understanding. They didn't need to speak. Words would have broken the sacredness of that moment, the kind you don't get many of in a life like Jonah's. He'd seen too much death, buried too much love. And yet here he sat, a man stitched together not by miracles, but by a woman who understood pain, not as weakness, but as proof that one had survived. When she finished, she pressed a soft cloth over his palm, letting her fingers linger. Still she said nothing. But in that silence, Jonah felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. Not the heat of a fire, but the warmth of being seen, truly seen, and not turned away. He reached out then, gently, and touched her wrist. "Thank you," he murmured. 2 words, heavy with everything else he didn't know how to say. "For the garden, for staying, for believing in something I forgot was possible." She gave a small, tired smile. Not triumphant, not romantic, just real. A flicker of light in a house that had known too much dark. The lamp still burned low as Jonah looked at her, truly looked, not just at her face, but into it. He saw the curve of her cheek where the light caught a faint scar, the shadow beneath her collarbone where bruises once lived. He saw exhaustion, yes, but also a quiet defiance, a strength made of silence and survival. She didn't flinch under his gaze, because she knew what he was seeing. And she was no longer afraid to be seen. Jonah leaned back slightly, letting the moment settle between them like dust on still air. He hadn't realized how loud grief could be until Lynn's presence began to quiet it. She didn't fill the space Sarah had left. No one could. But she had made the silence bearable. "I used to think scars were shame," he said quietly, eyes on his bandaged hands. "But maybe they're just the places God let us heal." She looked at him for a long time, then slowly nodded. Her voice came soft but steady. "And some scars are how He writes His name on us." Jonah felt his breath catch. He hadn't heard anyone speak of God in this house since Sarah passed, not out loud. But there it was. Not a sermon, not doctrine, just truth, wrapped in pain, spoken by someone who had knelt before suffering and risen again. He thought of the verse she'd embroidered into the hem of the patched shirt. He heals the broken-hearted. Not past tense, not someday, now, here, between them. The children's footsteps upstairs were soft. A door creaked, a floorboard groaned, but the two of them remained still, caught in a sacred hush that wasn't romance, not yet, but something deeper. A reverence. An acknowledgement that what they were building wasn't born of desperation, but choice. Jonah reached for the small tin of salve, dipped his fingers, and without speaking, gently placed his hand over hers, the one she'd burned weeks ago while mending the wood stove. She tensed, not in fear, but in memory. Then slowly she let him tend to her as she had tended him. It wasn't intimacy the way the world defined it. It was something far more lasting. Respect, recognition, a quiet covenant between two weathered souls. By morning, the storm had passed. The sky above the Nevada hills was scrubbed clean, not just of clouds, but of something deeper, a heaviness, a sorrow, the kind that lives in old bones and empty doorways. The ranch shimmered with raindrops. The garden, the one Lynn had fought to reclaim from death, drank in the light like it had waited for this moment all its life. Jonah stepped outside with his coffee, the steam rising in the chilled morning air. The world felt reborn, not in the grand biblical way, but in a smaller, quieter fashion, like a man blinking awake after a long sleep. The children were already outside. Miriam was crouched near the carrots, gently brushing away puddles. Eli pointed to a hummingbird darting between two stalks of lavender. Their laughter, once a memory, had become a sound again. And there was Lynn, kneeling in the garden, her back to him, sleeves rolled, hair damp and wild in the breeze. She wasn't planting today. She was just tending, checking, protecting, as if what grew there was more than vegetables, as if it was sacred. Jonah crossed the yard and stopped beside her. She didn't look up, but she felt him, like she always did. He didn't speak, just crouched beside her and reached into the earth with his bare hands. Pulled a weed, smoothed the dirt. That was the moment, not dramatic, but decisive. A line had been drawn in the mud yesterday, against Silas, against despair. But this was where Jonah redrew it in his heart. Not out of defense, but out of hope. He looked at Lynn, really looked. She turned to him, eyes shining in the morning sun, and for the first time he realized she wasn't carrying her pain anymore. She'd set it down, right here in this soil, and grown something better in its place. Their eyes met. She smiled, not with her lips, but with her whole being. And Jonah understood. This wasn't a new beginning. This was the continuation of everything that had ever mattered: kindness, dignity, choice. Those who sow in tears shall reap in joy. Psalm 126:5. And finally, Jonah Carver, widower, rancher, silent man of grief, knew the truth. He hadn't just protected her, she'd restored him. The morning sun stretched soft fingers across the Nevada hills, peeling back the silver mist left behind by the night storm. Dew clung to every blade of grass, every petal, not as weight, but as a blessing. The rose bush near the porch, once little more than a memory of Sarah, now bore new buds. Jonah stood at the edge of the garden, coffee in hand, watching the children chase one another between rows of lettuce and squash. Their laughter no longer startled him. It belonged here, like the wind, like the soil. He saw Lynn. She was hanging laundry on the line, her back to him. Her hair had come loose in the breeze, catching glints of sun. A linen sheet fluttered between them, then fell, revealing her quiet frame, steady as always. He walked over. Not quickly, not with fanfare. Just a man moving toward what he'd once lost and what he had now chosen to honor. She sensed him before he reached her, but she didn't turn. She didn't need to. Jonah gently placed a hand on her shoulder, warm, grounding, not claiming, just being there. A statement without words. Lynn paused, one clothespin in hand, and tilted her head just enough to acknowledge him. They stood like that, a widow and a woman who had outlived captivity, both surrounded by children who had learned to smile again. A silence wrapped them, not awkward, but sacred. And in that moment, Jonah remembered something Sarah had once whispered, long ago, as they watched a thunderstorm roll in from the west. "It's never the lightning that makes things grow, love. It's the rain after." He looked at Lynn now and understood. She hadn't replaced what he lost. She had helped him remember it, with gentleness. Not by erasing sorrow, but by giving it a place beside joy. And that's when the verse came to him, not from the preacher's mouth, not from any book, but from some quiet place in his soul he thought had dried up. Love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. 1 Corinthians 13:7. He wasn't in love with her, not yet, but he trusted her, he hoped with her, and he would protect her, because she had stood beside him not out of need, but out of strength. The last sheet fluttered into place. She turned then, finally, and looked up at him. No smile, no words, just her gaze, level, steady, unflinching. And in it, Jonah saw something he hadn't known in years. That love wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was linen on a line. Sometimes it was the sound of children laughing. And sometimes it was just a hand resting gently on a shoulder at the break of day. The sun had climbed higher now, warm on the porch wood and soft on the backs of bent shoulders in the garden. Inside, the house smelled of rising dough and wild mint. Lynn had baked bread early, and the scent lingered like a promise. On the table, a chipped pitcher held wildflowers, plucked by Miriam just after sunrise. They weren't arranged neatly, but they were alive. Jonah poured 2 cups of tea, his movements unhurried. When Lynn entered, he slid one toward her. She accepted it with a nod, then sat across from him. No formalities, just ease, the kind only earned after storms. He reached into his pocket and placed something between them. A folded handkerchief, worn and faded, its corners embroidered with his initials. She glanced down. Her fingers moved toward it, hesitant, unsure. "It was mine," he said quietly, "before the war, before Sarah." Link looked at him. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. She understood what he was offering. Not romance, not debt, but space. A seat at the table, a stake in the soil, a place in the story. Across the room, Eli and Miriam were bent over a sketchbook. Eli was drawing what looked like a barn, while Miriam insisted on coloring the chickens blue. It was a messy picture. It was perfect. Outside, the neighbors were gathering slowly, not with casseroles or questions, just with quiet gestures. A sack of potatoes left at the steps. A hammer borrowed, returned with a new handle. A pair of old hymnals passed through the window, yellowed and underlined. The silence that had once defined the ranch was now full of footsteps, of voices, of presence. Jonah stepped outside as Lynn remained behind, washing the teacups with care. He leaned against the railing, watching a breeze ripple through the drying laundry like a prayer. He didn't think of the past much anymore. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it had been named, honored, and finally laid down. In the garden, Lynn knelt between rows of carrots and radishes. The children had followed, chattering about worms and fairies. She laughed, a sound not born of politeness, but of being rooted. Jonah smiled, not just with his mouth, but with the quiet places in him that had once gone silent. They hadn't built something new. They had reclaimed what was always possible, a home forged not of blood or history, but of mercy and daily choice. They didn't build a new life. They unearthed the one that had been waiting, just beneath the ashes. And so, on a ranch once haunted by loss, a new kind of family began to grow, quietly, steadfastly, like the roses that bloomed from broken soil. Step into the heart of the frontier with our Western love stories, where healing grows in silence and love speaks through dust, light, and second chances. Each tale lingers like the scent of old wood and wild roses. Subscribe now and let your heart remember what it never forgot. If you love this story, please like, share, and leave a comment to let us know. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to read our latest works and give me more motivation to collect and share other stories.